Okay, so our second one that we're going to talk about is the developing of the genealogy of a community. And I had trouble trying to squeeze in again. You got so much good stuff that it's hard to decide the exact way to tell the story or whatever. But like I said, I was up late at night, but I figured these things out. I went to the first one. I didn't have any. I have some errors and I leave something on there because I pulled it from another place. But see, now I'm saying that the first thing was like if I have something wrong with it. But hopefully we'll keep going through. I've been working on this stuff for a long time because Matt gave me pretty good notice ahead of time that he wanted me to come. So here, there is, and we just talked about this, there is power in community. We all can say, my mama, Miss Clarice, call her Miss Clarice, we weren't related, but they lived at a kitty corner, as they say, our backyard, then you go over a little bit of empty lot, and then that's was their house. And they were in a Mademoiselle club together, where they were doing stuff that was, they were doing stuff. But mostly it was games. I mean, it was adult games. It was, they were good at poker and all bid whist and all those different things. So they were known. They had people coming from Chicago. There was a basketball player named Bob Love that played for the Bulls for a long time. Bob Love would come down there and play. He liked playing cards and stuff. He knew that was the place to come. A lot of entertainment and fun. Fed you good barbecue, as my uncle would say. And so it was the place to come. But those relationships in the community, as we went down the block, there were different relationships. But if I wanted to ask things about my mother that other people may not have known, and it wasn't like big secret stuff, right? But she would know things that the other ones wouldn't know, and I could collect certain information from her. So knowing that community and collecting this information, these interesting stories and whatever, is really how you that's what I'm trying to encourage you to do, is to consider, building out your community in a meaningful way. Because genealogists are too often focused on their individual families to the exclusion of those around you. And you don't think they have the answer that you're looking for, but you don't know the relationship because you haven't sought it out. You're going straight down that line, the straight line, direct ancestor right now there, and you got to go collateral, and you got to do these other things. So developing that community through what we call fan club or cluster genealogy is a key element to this successful ancestor hunting. You need those pieces. You may have 4 pieces to the puzzle and it's 8 pieces. And it's really hard to see what it is if you don't get those additional pieces and you're not looking in the right direction. They're over here, it's here, and it's here, and you're not looking in the right place. You're insisting on beating down that wall straight ahead, and it's not there. It's not there. That line petered out. That particular picture that had the names written on the back of it that you saw didn't survive that line. It's over here somewhere. And you got to find those people, and you got to find those relationships. You got to find how they're related to each other. So we call it the fan club. It's friends, associates, and neighbors. And it really is an essential component to this research process. So just like researching this fan club and these collateral lines, developing that profile of a community pays dividends. So it's going out even more than that. We lived on the hill. And it was really, when you drove up in 171, it was the hill. And that's where most of the Black people live. And so they knew each other. My sister, I just talked to my sister. I've got to interview her for the community because she knows, she grew up in 1940, she knows the connections in that community. Well, I don't know them. I was a little bit too late. I was playing sports and doing whatever, but she knows that community, and that community is so rich and is so interconnected that you need that history to be collected. And the most natural place really is like a library, archive, some place where you can partner with them in collecting this information, because you don't want to collect it and keep it because it's the community history. You want to be able to collect pictures and know the people in the community that were drafted and went into World War I or whatever, right? You want to know that community history, because then you get those connected pieces when you find out, oh, my ancestor was in World War I too, then find out that they were in the same place, because they weren't letting Blacks go anywhere. They had them in strict, segregated places as far as what they could do. So chances are, if several people went to World War I or whatever from your community, they probably built a bond over there. right? And so those kinds of things. And so you create that lasting benefit. And that lasting benefit is sharing that information, building that symbiotic relationship with the people in your neighborhood that can then have a platform to put it out there further. Because then when we start talking about migration, it's even more exciting to me, complicated, because you're tracking down these people and sharing that information too. And what I've learned lots of times is this, where there's smoke, there's fire. Where your people went, there's probably other people from that community. That's how they got there. Somebody went first, and then they started bringing other people, and all of a sudden the neighborhood has 3 or 4 people that are related in some kind of way, and not going to the same church up there in Brooklyn or whatever. So I started developing communities early because, again, that's because I'm not Robin Smith. I stopped researching my family, and I was just interested in the research process. I just love that type of stuff. And so my people came from Virginia, and they came into a little tiny community called Braidwood, Illinois, right? And it was a coal mining community, but I didn't know that because when we got around the table and were talking about stuff, we weren't talking about no coal mining. We weren't really talking about that old history, really. So I had no idea. I was playing on stuff that they call them slag piles or whatever we call it the dump. Because that's what they called it, but it was the dump. It was where they dumped out all the dirt and slag and whatever they were going down for the coal. And so those things you didn't know. And then I realized my family had they played a huge role in that when I say they collectively, because they and a whole bunch of people from Central Virginia to Bannock County came there to break a coal mining strike. And if they didn't break the strike, then there were some of the follow-on groups that came, again, that chain type of migration. And they came out to where Braidwood was a place here. It says it was an African-American established a presence in the coal mines and the community. The 1880 census, there were 386 of them on it. 1870 census, there was 0. The coal mining community brought them in. They had a coal mining strike. They brought in all black strike breakers because they figured that would break it. But they knew that whenever they brought in Italians or whatever from Chicago, they would go talk to them and say, hey, you don't want to do that, whatever. But when they brought the black strike breakers in, they didn't want them to join the union. There was different things. So the owners figured that kind of stuff out. So the town's last residents with ties to coal miners died in 2002. And one of them was my uncle. And we were laughing to talk about names. What was my uncle's name? Everybody called him Uncle Mud, M-U-D. To this day, nobody can still tell me why it was Uncle Mud. And I can't even remember if I asked him. But his name was Meredith. And I found him on the legal documents as Meredith. Everybody called him in town. Everybody, all his siblings and whatever, called him Mud. We called him Uncle Mud. They called him Mud. Hey, Mud. But he was one of the last ones, him and one other one that was related to me too. You don't get these small towns. Again, that's why you build a community. You don't get those small towns where people don't somehow become related most of the time through marriages and that type of stuff. And so what I ended up doing there, you see, I wrote an article for the Historical Society because I didn't want to keep it to myself. All these people I'm finding, all these people that we talk to every so often, my mom or my sister and whatever, and every so often they say, oh, they're from Braidwood too. And so then you had that commonality and there was the First Baptist Church of Braidwood where everybody went. And so there was those commonality things. So I knew that most of the people that I was talking to probably didn't know this history, and I needed to have that history out there. So I wrote this about the early days through lots of records and stuff. And so I got somebody at the Historical Society said, you need to write this. I said, okay. So I ended up writing it. So this Braidwood strike, trying to figure out, well, what are you collecting? What are you doing? The cornerstone of this research that I was doing, this community research, was I was working as a teacher then, and I started copying every African-American marriage record in the county from 1877 to 1902. 1902 was when the reel ran out. This microfilm, cranking microfilm at the Morris Public Library. Once I got out of school, once I got done coaching track, I went there until they closed at 9 o'clock. Then I went home. It was the opposite direction. But that's what I had to do. Every one that said black, colored, whatever, I copied them all because I was building a community. And so what it did is it revealed these family relationships through the generations and these migration origins. The superficial stuff that was out there in the white established historical record said where the blacks came from in general. They came from Virginia, they came from Kentucky, they named about maybe 2 states of the primary states, but they weren't given any counties, but they weren't given the counties, they weren't given that detailed information. But that stuff was coming to the surface with the marriage records because lots of times they were saying they spoke in counties. My grandfather, who I never met, he always said, my 104-year-old aunt, you know, she'll say, I said, if I was there yesterday, if I said it to her, I said, where was Pop Pinnick born? Pop Pinnick always said he was born in Fluvanna County. Never gave a place because it was so rural, there really wasn't a place, you know, that he could really hang his hat on. So Fluvanna County, and sure enough, when I'm looking at a lot of these marriage documents and think, what am I seeing? Fluvanna County, Fluvanna County. So I'm able to then crowdsource and see the people that were from Fluvanna County. And interesting things will happen when you start analyzing data and looking at this information. What is interesting that many of the people that were from Fluvanna County did what? Married other people that were from Fluvanna County, right? Because again, it was a familiarity with them. They knew their families, whatever. And so you start learning things and putting together within that community pockets and different pieces of the puzzle. So these family relationships were coming out and the major migrations from where they were showing up. I saw these families flow from Central Virginia through Indiana, Brazil, Indiana, Clay County. Coal mining was there. That's where they came in. They came into that area, Brazil, a place called Clay City or something like that. There's another place, again, Clay City or something like that, had Clay in it. But those were the couple places where I was finding them. And so that led me to, that was their intermediate stop. And so that was leading me to records when I was looking. I came to Brazil, you know, a couple of times to look at all the marriages and all the births and stuff, because I knew these people, if they said they were born in Virginia, their kids were born in Indiana, I knew the chances were they were born in Clay County as I built this community out. So I was getting this knowledge that really was much more granular than what you would find in a book, a general book that talked about the history of Blacks in coal mining or whatever in those communities and stuff. So I could answer those questions. So I was a guy that could answer questions now. People will come to the reunions and we're talking about some family members where, you know, hey, I don't want to deal with that family stuff. But you had the historian that did a little piece or whatever at the reunion that knew the family history. I was that guy. I always got my 10 minutes or whatever, talk about the family and the connections and things like that. But I could answer questions. People would come to me, then I had a reputation that I would see people, they come over to visit my mom or do whatever and whatever. And they say, Timmy, tell me again. My mom always said that we were related, but she never said how. But because I had that knowledge in who those surnames were, 9 times out of 10, I could just rattle it right now and say it was back your father, generation, and then their common ancestor was this or whatever. And every African-American community deserves that. They deserve the genealogy of the community, that anybody can come in there and know how they're connected and why things didn't make sense to them as far as, I always remember mama always, or I remember this or that or whatever, the special treatment or different things or the way she felt when they died or whatever. It didn't kind of make sense. When you build out that community, you build out the relationship, and then it's clear as to why it was. And every community should have that. So what I ended up doing here in this case is, you can see me, I just started building out. Excel was the thing I was comfortable with. So I started just using Excel spreadsheet. I put all those marriages in there. I put all these other things that I had, World War I cards and whatever. I would put that stuff in a thing and I could sort it the way I wanted to sort it or whatever. So that's the way I could figure out and keep track of things, was using an Excel spreadsheet when I wrote that. So then there was this Roslyn strike in 1888. And Roslyn, I had no idea what Roslyn was. Again, it's those things where, fortunately, I say we were talking again. I missed the boat on so many different things because I started late. And so those people that were in the 60s and 70s and whatever that really knew and were one generation removed from the slave, being the slave, their relative, the ancestor that was enslaved, you missed the opportunity for some of that stuff. You still were able to find some things, and I was able to have some success by being able to go and ask some questions, and that propelled me to have some of the answers. And that's what led me to Roslyn, Washington, in a coal mining strike. Sound familiar? Another coal mining strike. Because I was missing people on the census. I'm like, where are these people? And then I happened to find somebody in some kind of maybe it was a newspaper account or whatever, and it started pointing to Washington. And I'm like, what are they doing in Washington? But then, they're coal miners in Washington. So things started to in my head, bells started to go off and stuff. But Roslyn, they had a strike in 1888. African-Americans there, they established a presence in the coal mines and the community, just like Braidwood, just like Brazil. And these people, because of the timing, they ended up on the 1889 Washington territorial census. Because Washington wasn't a state yet, it was Washington Territory. They were right on the cusp of becoming a state. And so all these people slid in right before that census. And so they're like first families of Washington as far as when their statehood came, they were there. And they got in right under the bell. Like they came in December. They came in December 1888, and the census was in 1889. So I said, so really cool things that they're part of history, but you really don't kind of know that they're part of the history. And so I ended up starting to write. So again, I wrote it out. I went out there and I was doing historical talks because I would go out researching. I get to know people, and they'd invite me back to do a historical talk or whatever. And so it forced me to start compiling and writing this stuff down and writing the information down. And so I wrote several different articles, historical papers that I presented in Washington about this particular community because I knew my family was tied to it. And it was just by luck that I ended up figuring that out. It wasn't through the research I had done necessarily initially. What it was is my Aunt Dorothy, my Aunt Dot, the one I was talking about earlier that we were like, she was born before you were married. She was the one that out of the family, my mom had three siblings, so it was four of them. She was the oldest, and she was the one that they clicked. She clicked with the people on my grandmother's side of the family that moved out there. So my mom knew them, but she didn't have that relationship with them. My Aunt Patsy didn't, my Aunt Rose didn't. It was Aunt Dorothy that was always corresponding with them on a regular basis. So when I started poking around genealogy and saying I can't find people or whatever, and my mom said, you need to ask your Aunt Dorothy because there's people that are far out west somewhere or whatever. She's in touch with them all the time. And she was the key for me to get into that because that woman out there was 90-some years old, whatever. She knew who I was. She just saw that interview. Yeah. I got an interview before I had to pass the test. Whose child are you? Tell me who your daddy and your mama was, and I had to go through all that. But I do the stuff, and so I passed the test. And she invited me out. It was one of the best conversations I ever had. I recorded her and whatnot, but it was wonderful. But that was a branch of my family that my grandmother and this woman's mother were sisters. But that tie hadn't got completely broken because my Aunt Dorothy knew and it was connected with them. So she called out there, secured it. I was in California then. I made the call, and then there was a gatekeeper. Her daughter was the one that I saw first, and I talked to her and stuff. And she was in Seattle. And then after I got done talking to her, I left, and I got the call that I could come to Roslyn and talk to the Queen. So it was just so again. So I did the kind of same thing. I was building, so now I got the spreadsheet. I can combine the spreadsheets at any time, and because I knew these families were related. So when I started getting death records and getting places and that kind of stuff, I was still building out, and I was just expanding my things. There would be Braidwood and more, or something like that, and I started adding other things to because I can manipulate it then. Because I might put in 90 records. I don't know how they're related. I'm just putting it in. Now I can sort it by, city or state or whatever and start seeing things that made sense and making connections and things like that. So that's what I was doing there. So these, like I said, what I found is African-American coal miners, they were going wherever they could go. They were exercising their manhood. I loved it. They were exercising their manhood by pushing white people out of jobs that they kept them out of for so long. And so it was payback. But they had to be brave because it wasn't like they can just walk in. They had to face shotguns and all this other kind of stuff. So there was a lot of drama going on. But some of these guys were USCT soldiers from the Civil War and whatever. So they were like, bring it on. So it's really interesting, the history and whatever. And actually it took a lot of courage for them to do it. But they were so confident, they brought their families with them in many cases. That we proved that they didn't go first. They was clear and they were like, no, we good. And they did. They came in. But they built like stockade things for them. So when the train came, they went into the stockade and then they were just safe to do their stuff. So in a decade, people that were enslaved in on the East Coast in Virginia had moved all the way across in a matter of 10 years, and they were on the other coast. And I found that was amazing. And somebody said they saw me at Midwestern Roots, and that's when I did a talk about my coal mining family and the ones that went all the way across and ended up in Washington State. I did a talk at the Midwestern Roots conference about that. So those were the two things where I started doing. I said, no, I need to do this. I want to build community. And then Thurber came. Thurber was my first full-blown, and watch my time, my first full-blown project that was related to community building. And that Uncle Mud I talked about, God rest his soul, again, that thin line, he was the one that enabled me to be successful in finding Thurber, Texas. Not only finding Thurber, Texas, but finding his mother's father. His mother was born in 1890, and he never knew his father. But again, he knew stuff because he was in the house. He was the oldest son and whatever. But he just knew that my grandma Ida was born. She had a twin, Ada. They were born in March 23rd, 1890. But on the 1900 census, mother was married to somebody else. So she's married to him. It's not him. And so it's, within 10 years. And what's interesting, again, we talk about this stuff, the stuff we have on our family, on our charts or whatever and stuff. If it's coming off of a death certificate or off a census or whatever, it's highly suspect until you can verify it with other stuff. Because I think she said she was a widow. And if I wasn't too seasoned, I would have been, the okie doke, I'd have been going in a different direction looking for a death certificate. And there wasn't a death certificate. He dead to me. Pretty much what she was thinking. That's just my take, right? She didn't mess up. And I don't think it was anybody else that filled out their census either. And when you heard the story, he just booked. He just left.
I had a question. So back during that time, well, decades ago, could people get away with being married to one person?
I'd say, well, yes, but it was easier to do it then, especially if they were traveling. They could keep the separate families and whatever. But it was big. I mean, in most states, bigamy, they could be prosecuted for it. So I think in most places it probably was unlawful to do it.
But would the state at that time, did they have the resources, or were they interested in making, like if somebody walked in, wanted a marriage certificate, would they make sure that person wasn't married in another state before they handed it out?
You have to test and affirm or whatever. If that's where they get you. If you lie, then they can come back. If they wanted to put you in jail, they put you in jail. And most of the time, again, it was offense. They put you in jail because the wife probably would sign out to, put that no good as whatever in jail. Yeah, she wanted him in jail. And so, and lots of times when you see divorces and that kind of stuff, really, Thurber had some really good stuff because coal mining men were different breed, a lot of them. And so some of the stuff was really, really good. But then women be figuring that stuff out, not necessarily the girlfriend or the whatever, and they were figuring out. And so again, they want to know why should we grant you this divorce? And they would just lay it out. It was, hey, I came home and Susie was in there and hey, it was on. And so they have documentation, they have witnesses and that kind of stuff. In the divorce cases, interesting. But what you should do, I recommend we're going to talk about African-American newspapers are absolutely fantastic. And so you get into one of those big ProQuest databases or whatever, you put bigamy in there and see how many hits you get. And you can read up and you probably know more than me. Because really, and lots of the socialites and whatever stuff, lawyer, white filing divorce or whatever, claimed that he had a wife in New York too, and Chicago and stuff. So you'll see that kind of stuff. And when you saw that kind of stuff, they can most likely they get charged with that stuff. So Thurber was a place that my great grandfather on my mom's, my dad's paternal side, is my grandmother on my dad's side. her father, for whatever reason, he left. And they didn't talk about it. Never was brought up again. Just I remember something about the coal mining, they just didn't talk about those kinds of things. But when I started doing research, I started asking questions. And my research, again, way back in the day, I'm using microfilm and stuff. I just couldn't find him because ancestry didn't exist. And his name was Jordan Johnson. So I wasn't going to be looking too hard. I just wanted to wait and bide my time. But one time I was driving through Braidwood, again, a little tiny town. I went to Illinois State, so it was on route. So sometimes I would just pull in and lots of times, I'll be honest, I just go right past Uncle Mud's house because we didn't have a whole lot in common and it wasn't a lot to talk about. So I'd go to the doggone library, Braidwood Library, and do research and whatever. And sometimes I would stop, most of the time I wouldn't stop. Something told me to stop instead. I turned, I stopped, I said, let me pull over there. He was in the back with his daughter and grandchildren and whatever, sitting on a picnic table. I came to, this is back in the day, wasn't no telephone, maps and all that stuff. It was the random McNally's. And so I just asked him. I said, it was in my, I said, I'm trying to find, I said, this is where I am now. I found this person. I said, I don't, she's married again. I said, you ever hear about, we knew his name was Jordan Johnson, though, because the marriage certificate, we had a marriage certificate. I said, whatever happened to Jordan Johnson? I said, I can't find him at all. And he sat there and he thought for a bit and whatever. And he said, and I was just quiet. He says, he didn't die. He was alive. He was in Texas. And I'm like, then he went quiet. I'm like, you're almost there. Oh, I need more in Texas. Texas is a big state. And I was just patient. And that's what people do to interrupt. I gave him as long a pause as he needed. He could have went there and just went to sleep or whatever. I'll let him go to sleep. But he said it took a while. He was 80-something years old. He said, he couldn't remember. He said the magic words. He said, the town sounded like, started with something, the TH sound. I was a track star. I think I set the record running from that picnic table to my car to get my Rand McNally map. Because all the towns in alphabetical order by state, I went all the way down to the T's. I'm like, please be something that starts with TH, whatever. One thing started with TH, Thurber, Texas. And I had it. When I went and looked at the records and the indexes and whatever, I came up with Thurber, Texas. So that's what got me in Thurber. Well, again, look at, it's a coal mining town. 1888, around that time is when the Texas and Pacific Coal Company purchased them. They did the same thing the other ones did. They had a coal mining strike. And for some reason, my great-grandfather decided he was going to go down there and leave my great-grandmother with 2 kids, and I don't know how many others before he left. But they had a big family. But he made a decision to leave. So I found him and everything. But it was a fascinating place. It was really an interesting place. They had coal mining records that usually didn't exist other places, like the individual records, company records that you rarely find. And so I ended up going down there. And that's why it became my full-blown project, because I had the whole community in front of me because of the different records that they had. And this is the thing we find all the time, right? And the church can say amen, because I use all that was written about Thurber. The middle book was a lot about heavy Italian because there's so many Italians there and whatever. But I go to the back, African Americans or Black or Negro, to see what they might be saying about us. And just like with so many of those community histories, they were lacking in color. So I wasn't getting much lead, but I was getting a few little, again, you get something that leads you to the next thing. So I got some other things. I won't have time to talk about that. I do a whole talk on that. But I got some leads that led me to some places and stuff. So Thurber was no longer there. It was a coal mining community. Coal got replaced by oil. They moved on to different places, so it was gone. But that segregation remained. That Thurber cemetery there was segregated. It was like the graveyard. Let me read this. The graveyard was divided into 3 sections with separate entrances for Catholics, Protestants, and African Americans. Sure enough, when I got there, I saw the 3 gates. 3 gates. And so again, so it was a place, so I knew that racism and stuff was alive and well, and I could know that he experienced that while he was there, just based on how they laid him out once they were dead. There was a book written that said, we're all dark, or we're all something down there. It's a coal mining book We're all dark down there. I don't think it's all black. We're all dark down there. But when you come out of the mine, everybody's black because the coal mine does. And so blacks made it. Hey, why when we down there, we brothers, when we get up here, once you go into your place and shower, we have to go in our separate place and shower. And now all of a sudden, you're looking at skin tone. Yeah, and so that kind of stuff. So that's interesting. So Thurber was no longer there. But it required more thought and planning than writing a little article, right? Writing an article for Historical Society or delivering a historical paper. There was so much stuff that I was really, really interested. And I wanted to go a step further than I did with recreating this community that most people did not know about. When I went down there and asked questions, they didn't know much about the African-American community. They just knew they always know the one black family. So I got my one black family that stayed there, and he got buried in a separate place, and that's the only one they could recite and whatever. I was like, not good enough. So I started working on it. We started sharing information and stuff. So I created something called Data Central. So it's still a spreadsheet, but I was more strategic. And I had written a little grant and got a little bit of money to make my trip down to look at those unique records that still existed for the Texas and Pacific Coal Company. So this is what made this work. One of the features was I was able to converge all the data. The World War II stuff, I went through everybody that was in that county, Erath County, that was black, that had a World War I card, they got in, right? So every piece of information I could find, it was in. So World War I cards, census cards, vital record stuff, cemetery stuff I pulled out of the cemetery books, all that stuff were the key features. They all were in this. So now I could manipulate them and see how many people were in those different categories, how many people had death certificates that I could find and that kind of stuff. And what did their death certificates say about where they actually were born and that kind of stuff. So I was able to put all that stuff in there and have it a lot more organized than I did when you saw the other little spreadsheets that I had. This was a cool thing. Because I was actually teaching business classes then. I was teaching the Microsoft Office package. So I was really familiar. That's why I used Excel versus, using something that was more complicated, Access or whatever, because I was just familiar with it. I knew it could do what I knew it needed to do. It was just easy to manipulate. It was comfortable. I was comfortable with it. But what it allowed me to do was to link to the actual documents. So I was talking about analyzing stuff. That was so important for me to be able to look and link when I started doing analysis and say, okay, I got all these brothers, whatever, documents for whatever. Let me look at them in order and see what I see, what they're telling me and that kind of stuff. So I'll be able to go onto a hyperlink and bring the document right up. So I can do all that analysis right from the laptop, and then I just close it out. I can bring up any of my documents so it's like family tree. Before family tree became family tree in a way, I was able to, or ancestry with their family tree, I was able to do that kind of stuff. I love this. And we talked about this before. I was able to comment boxes. Remember I talked about people that belong to, the Masons versus this versus that. I was able to make notes about things I found or things I learned, little thing I gleaned from a newspaper. I was able to put that information in there, and that additional information was on there. So when I'm looking at that person, I can look at that. And then the last thing I talked about was sorting. I was able to sort it on different things, and you'll see an example of that, how I'm going to go into an example of how that was important. So I started developing work strategies. So when I put the grant together, I said what I wanted to do, and I had to be somewhat detailed, but it was kind of loose too, because I didn't know what I was going to find, but I knew how I was going to try to organize it and what my outcome I hoped would be. So anyway, so here's a guy, one of the people. I call it targeted work strategy. His name was John Booker. So again, I'm analyzing him. I found him in 1900, and there he is with his family. I expect to find him, he's young. I expect to find him in 1910, which I did. Okay. Now he's 20 years old, I think, there. Still there. Then I didn't, let me back up. But I couldn't find him in Thurber in 1920. And I'm like, okay, where did he go? So it was a mystery. So that became a task for me now to figure out where he was, because he wasn't there. But that was just kind of a random task in a way. It's like, okay, I'm gonna try to find him. And then this is what happened. Again, when I'm doing analysis of the stuff, I'm just not letting it sit there. I realized, because I'd been doing so much research and understood the records and what kind of records existed, I was like, he's 20 years old. He's a World War I registration age. he was compelled to fill that out. Some people didn't, and they looked for him and they would arrest him. But I said, chances are he filled out a World War I card. So I'm thinking, and I had all the World War I cards. So I didn't go back looking through all of those, thinking I had missed him. I figured he had migrated because he's a coal miner. And sure enough, that's what he had done. I found him in Oklahoma, in another coal mining community. But because I followed that strategy or thought about that thing about the World War I card, how it fit, see, everybody's thing is going to be different when you got to research. I'm trying to find so-and-so. And that's what you got. You got to know the records and you got to understand what you need to look at to possibly find your answer. And that's what I ended up doing. And so then that really became a work strategy for me. Because if it worked for him, right, I knew then that I had not strategically got all of the World War I cards for everybody that was in my database. So now what I had to do, I ended up creating a new column. It was are they World War I eligible? And so I figured out the people based on the census or whatever, when they were born, and if they were within that range where they should have filled out a World War II card, then I put their information in there as far as when they were born or whatever, and triggered. And then I put another column that said, once I checked it. So some days, then when I did work a couple hours a week or whatever, one week I do finding World War II people that are missing. So I'd go through and I'd spend that couple hours just trying to find where they were. And I was successful then. That was that targeted strategy of filling in the sheet based on that strategy I developed by doing that analysis. That makes sense?
Process of elimination. So with this particular example, were you able to find that he was Oklahoma based on his draft card, or did he get out of being drafted because he?
No, he had moved, and I can't remember now because I have it in front of me. If he moved again, I'm sure there probably were other people from Thurber that moved with him. For whatever reason, they decided that they were going to go there because the marriage, don't know exactly, but he moved there, and I knew it was him. Again, John Booker, fairly common, but what I circled there is Thurber. So there's a couple different kinds of World War I craft. I think it's an A, B, and C card. And thank goodness that the card that he had to fill out for the time he had to register was the one that asked him where he was born. So that nailed it for me, right? We talk about evidence, some being lighter, some being heavier than others. That was really concrete. I'm like, that's him. Because when I go back in the other thing, it says place of birth on the census and whatever, Texas, Texas, Texas. So I knew he was there. And so I had other evidence. So yeah, so I got him nailed. And then what I did too, again, now I know what coal company he worked for. So now I know what coal company, or one of the coal companies in Oklahoma that hires blacks. So I've got this information now that's why I'm trying to write a book on coal mining, because it's going to have lists of the different places where blacks could go. So when people know that there are people were coal miners, they know where to go look, potentially to find them if they've lost them. Because I'm kind of laying the groundwork for that in this big project of building that community. So I created a new column for that particular thing. Here's the second one I'll share with you. Again, when we research certain things, again, you start developing strategies. Because I didn't read a book on how to do community building. I just did it and figured I was intelligent enough to figure out what I needed to do when I was stuck on certain things and just figure it out. So here's that Erath County marriage records from 1891 to 90. They had a set of them for each of these different. God bless the woman that, again, these are societies that were out there that did the work, these genealogy societies. So here's the one for the Erath County Genealogical Society. I was able to go to the Dallas Public Library when I was there and do the work. And so what I'm introducing you is something called the Crouch method. I developed the Crouch method, and I named it after a minister by the last name was Crouch. And so I was going through, and I was methodical. This is the thing when you talk about the community. By the time I had spent several months with this group, just like with the Braidwood people, I knew them like they were all family. You recognize the names, you knew the surnames. I went to bed and woke up dreaming of these surnames and stuff. So I knew the names when I saw it. I said, oh yeah, he was from Thurber, he was from whatever. I knew that by then, but it had been several months before I even got to the grant. So when I went to the thing, I've got surnames in my head. So I'm going down through and I'm pulling out and putting them in my database, the ones, because the book wasn't segregated. I had to go down through and know that community in order to pull that person out. And so I would know that by the names, and then I would verify it by the 1910 census or whatever. So how many years you married? We were married 8 years. Well, I go look at the 1902, and I should find them in there because I know approximately when they were married, within a give or take a year or so. So that's the kind of logic and strategic stuff I was doing. And so I pulled them all out, the ones I knew. And I was just blind. That was my task that day or that week or that month. It took maybe several weeks. So I did. But here's that sheet. I had another epiphany when I started looking at this, and I realized that I had found Reverend Crouch. He was just a minor at one point, then he became a reverend. And so I'm finding, when I started looking over in the reverend column of who married them, all of a sudden I'm seeing him, which I expected to see, but I was on a sheet where there was a name I didn't recognize, but I recognized his name. And here's the facts that we know, right? This is the kind of thing we know. Again, when you get more and more experience, what I knew is he wasn't marrying no white folk. Right? He wasn't marrying white people. So I knew when I looked at that person that the likelihood they were black was 100%. He was marrying black people. And there were black people that had slipped under the radar for me because I went through them methodically, not looking for him, but looking for the names I knew and that I had got clues with from the censuses. These people weren't on the census. That's the whole thing too. 10 years. That's a lot of time to do a lot of stuff. And people that depend on the census, forget about it. It's great, but you got to start figuring out where they were and where they moved during that time period. And so I missed them. And I didn't have a strategy to try to find them because I wasn't that smart. I was kind of smart, but I wasn't that smart. But on the back end, I figured it out. And so what I did then, what did I do? I went back and got all those books. The next trip to the Dallas Public Library, I got all those books. And what I do? I went right down and I was looking for Crouch. And as I looked for him, I looked to see, did I have that one in my database? Yes. Do I have that one in my database? Yes. Do I have that? Nope. And I started adding, I added several dozen names that I pulled out that I then confirmed were African-Americans through other records now that I knew them. And then again, the coal mining community is starting to, now I'm starting to find people that's in Oklahoma and in different places. I'm starting to find them in different places because they weren't in Thurber in 1900 or 1910. But they had kids there. They were there for 3-4 years in between the censuses. So I was building that community and I was finding people that I couldn't account for in any other way. So I call it the Crouch method because I was going down and finding everything on Crouch. And so it's the Crouch method because now I got a system. So now I'm going and I'm looking at all of my stuff, all the newspaper accounts, whatever. And every time I found a black preacher's name, minister's name, I pull those books out again. And now I'm looking for Croker. I'm looking for Proctor. I'm looking for different. And if they were black, they were marrying black. And so I was able to pull out quite a few extra people by using the Crouch method and just going down and grabbing the ministers. So again, it's these strategies that you come up with when you're trying to build out. That's why I'm sharing these with you. If you at some point decide to start doing this kind of stuff, you know, I'm helping you so you can not make the same mistake and just get moving faster. Because these are the kind of things that aren't written in most books. And it's just stuff that I discovered by, you know, hard work and figuring this stuff out. So this is a sheet. It doesn't have everybody. I need to update it at some point when I get an assistant. But this is like you can see some of the communities all across the country where there were locales connected to Indian Territory, different places in Virginia. See my Savannah County down there, the third one from the bottom. You see a couple of Indiana ones, several Indiana ones. And so you see all these different things. And like the blacks were there at some point in time. I documented them there before or after Thurber. So this is going to be a great book at some point if I can ever write the book. But really what I'm going to write is I call it a monograph. Basically, just a whole thing that talks in details, almost like I'm talking to you in a way, and just tell the story of it and have charts and have different things that describe the African-American community and tell the story of them. Because I have lots of information and I can be able to tell that quite easily. Let's get a picture of that. And so what this teaches us, though, is that migration plays a significant role in the community recreation effort. we kind of know it sometimes, and we talk about the Great Migration or whatever, but we've been migration since we got out the boat. They started selling us and moving us wherever it was involuntary up until 1865 for the majority of them. But even after that, they started moving. And I said, I'm going to move on because, boy, I can tell you some stories. The migration stuff I found. Our people were very resilient, very smart. They were very, when they were hiring them out, oh, yeah, you can have my Negro, you know, whatever, and they making extra money or whatever, and they send them to Richmond. They figuring out what's going on in Richmond because they ain't hitting that same stuff in the rural area. They're learning what's going on. Stuff they got here, that road that goes north. They figuring out stuff to where they can plan. That's the stuff that planted the seeds a lot of time, where they built those connections and learned on the people on the James River, on the boats and stuff. Hey, pay you enough to get you on the boat to get me out to whatever. And I can take it from here or whatever. That's the kind of stuff. It's not in the history book, but that's the stuff that was happening. And it's very obvious when you look at a lot of the stuff and the people that ran away or left or whatever, when they had to leave somewhere, they knew where to go because they communicated. They might not have been able to read and write, but they were so resilient. They figured stuff out, and they figured you didn't have to learn how to read or write. They were talking. It was a network, and they worked it out. It's just fantastic. It's just amazing. Our people were absolutely amazing. So we're going to talk. I said, I'm going to talk about get y'all out of here in time. I said, the food done came. I said, I'm not going to keep you back long. I won't get trampled. So 2 key community building tools. I'm going to share 2 more tools that are really key. That were very, and now with technology, it makes them even more key. And you'll see this. That's the thing too. Like with Franklin Carter, once you get new tools to use, you can go back to an old thing and apply it and now generate a whole bunch of new stuff. And so newspapers, again, I got so interested in newspapers, but newspapers were really critical in trying to figure stuff out and move forward. And so I love me some Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump. So newspapers are like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to find. Because it's so true. Newspapers have so much information, and Black newspapers is all about Black people. You know, white people are in there. Now, again, you have to read my book. White people are in there, and they're in there in certain ways because they're advertising, because they're always about that dollar. Mm-hmm. So they advertising in Black newspapers, their businesses and whatever, hoping to entice Blacks to come to their business and stuff. So they're in there that way. They're rarely in there any other way. This is something kind of spectacular. They might put it in there. But that paper is by forward about Black people. And so you find all kind of amazing things. And you just don't know, you don't know what you're going to find. So here's some stuff. These African-American newspapers are so amazing. They reveal new information, some of which can't be found elsewhere, right? And so now it's going to be something where you were stuck. You couldn't have found that if it wasn't something that ended up somehow, some way in the Black newspaper, and it won't necessarily be the Black newspaper that was in that area. We're going to talk about it. It'd be somewhere else. Because that's the way Black newspapers were set up and organized. It could be a source of information that can confirm information found elsewhere. Again, we talk about a death certificate and they have a name on it or have something. It's like, I need a second piece of information because this just isn't good enough. It's flimsy. And it can do that kind of stuff. It covers the lives of African Americans in so many ways, unlike no other resource. The white mainstream paper were not covering Black people that way. If you stole some chickens, I'm being serious. If you stole some chickens, or we're talking about somebody, if you had a steal on your property or whatever, you know, they just want to reinforce why we got these Black codes and all this stuff in place because you can't trust these Black folks. So it's not always, but that was something you knew that in these papers, you would learn about them being so industrious and doing all kinds of things that you just would not find in the mainstream paper in that town. In most cases, it identifies and documents, and that's the key thing, it documents community activities and institutions. You build out the community when you find out who knows who's going where, going back south to see people in certain town and whatever. That's the kind of stuff that's so critical. I don't care what President Theodore Roosevelt's doing and what he did, whatever. I don't care about that. Some of the newspaper had that, but they had a lot of this stuff. So what these Black newspapers reveal, stuff like this, their pre-Civil War status. After 1870, we want to know. Were they, and we draw blanks a lot of times. We look at the 1860, they're not there. Were they enslaved? Most likely they were. So now we're sitting there stuck. We're idling. And it might tell us what that they were owned by somebody or they were a slave. This old Negro slave died, that kind of stuff. You find that stuff. Tree, vital record, death details. You want to cry sometime when you see that, the vital records for Maryland or vital records for whatever started at this time. And the person I'm looking for died 5 years before that or whatever. But a newspaper might give you that. Military service connections. If you find a military service connection, then you're looking for a pension, especially if it's USCT, that kind of stuff. It can just blow your whole stuff up when you find that pension record that's talking about all kinds of stuff, including the slaveholder. Social networks. It gives you all those social networks. Who is talking to who and why. Business networks. African-American was so industrious. They really had lots of businesses in these communities. And you get to find out some of them that you might not have known about through these. Church affiliation. And that's why I did the church thing, the church talk. Because, oh my goodness, the things that you learned through the affiliations and the activities, they were so active. This is where women got their due. You find it in there. Because most of the time it's what these Black men did in churches, and they were preachers, and they were deacons and whatever. Black women were taking care of business in those churches. And most of the time, when you see it on a census, keeping house, right? You keeping house, you domestic this and domestic that. When she was done dusting and doing whatever, she was out there in the church more time, longer than her husband was, doing all kind of stuff, going to conventions, Sunday school, Baptist conventions, and all kind of stuff. And it showed up in this stuff. It's really exciting. Pullman porters, you hear about Pullman porters. They say that was the rise of the middle class. So you find a Pullman porter, you're going to find records, try to figure out what rail line they work for. They got a pension and that kind of stuff. So it opens the door to a lot of things if you got a Pullman porter. Entrepreneurial, and they're so entrepreneurial, they're getting their own businesses set up, and then they're connecting with other people. Migration clues is what you're getting here when you start reading about so-and-so going because of the death of their brother back in Claiborne County, Tennessee, or whatever, that kind of stuff. When you can't find a marriage record, you start finding stuff like I did with Brazil. If I didn't know about Brazil, I'm looking for them back in Fluvanna County. But the newspaper's telling me them going back here or going to places that I didn't know before, that's where they got married. Because this is a fact. Migrations took place in many different ways. They weren't just a migration straight. That was a rarity. Just like I'm talking about the big plantations. Most times they couldn't afford it. It was step migration. They were going so far that money would help get another job, work, whatever, and then move a little further. So at some point, they could get married en route. And you find that quite often when you get so frustrated because you can't find the marriage where they were born or where they moved to. And then you get African-American viewpoints, because you don't get in the newspaper, the main newspaper. So you hear a lot about the different newspapers and stuff. So Black newspapers, and they have these similarities and they have these distinct differences. And with these papers, it's true. They will have their own personality because the owner is just different in the way he wants to. He'll tweak it and he'll do things how he can feel like he can make money. It was very hard to make money with Black newspapers. So based on the editor or the owner, it'll take some time to look at those papers and figure out how he rolled. What does he do? What I can expect to be in that newspaper versus another newspaper. That's important, right? Each newspaper has its own business or practice strategy. So for example, we'll talk about this quite a bit. A number of Black newspapers were distributed in multiple editions. Some of them didn't survive, but some of them did. The Baltimore Afro-American, the Chicago Defender, they both had a national edition and they had a local edition. Most of the time that was survived in the national edition, but boy, if you can find that local edition, you're rocking and rolling. Norfolk Journal and Guide. That's an amazing paper because of where it was in Norfolk. In the Delmarva Peninsula area, it had such a connection. It had a local one. It had a interstate one that just covered the states that were up against Virginia because they had so much migration and that was their area. And then they had the national one. I found all three editions of that in a Black college. In a Black college, I found all three. One of the few that I found all of those in one place. So it's a gold mine because you're going to find stuff in one that you're not going to find in the other. So the primary reason that so many ancestors appear in these newspapers, especially the big newspaper, I keep saying the Chicago Defender, is because of this concept called community and social columns. Those were in these newspapers. So these community and social columns, they're really, to me, the most valuable aspect of Black newspaper research, because that gets down in the nitty gritty, talking about who was sick, who did this, who did that. It's all in these things. It's that simple stuff that we want as genealogists, and they're spilling the beans. They're telling all this different stuff that's going on. Teaching professions, so many of our ancestors were teachers, saying where they went to teach and that kind of stuff. It's all kind of information. But here's where you find most of these social columns. And again, you don't think, it's not logical, you don't really think that way. But because of migration, the major papers, this is a collection. This is very expensive. You find it pretty much at university libraries if they have all of the papers, all 10 papers now. But they have, these are the major African-American newspapers. So somebody in Pittsburgh may be getting the Chicago Defender for whatever reason, right? And so but why do they do that? It's because each of these papers, again, they had all of these social columns, and that's how they sold the newspapers. When people migrated different places, their sister married somebody who was from Chicago, and they went to Chicago, whatever, they would write what was going on back in Sedalia, Missouri or whatever. And so there'd be a column, what was happening in Sedalia in Chicago Defender newspaper. And so they got to read about their back home in a major newspaper that you think was, oh, that's too big for the little country folks. That was exactly what they did. That's how they made money. So they weren't getting the white advertising dollars. So here's two papers you should be familiar with. These two papers, and again, they show that distinct difference between these papers. Two fantastic papers. Both of them are excellent. So you got the Recorder and you got the Freeman. But they had two different owners and they had two different strategies. So here with the Recorder, they had in their masthead, Negro newspaper devoted to the interests of the colored people of Indiana. Very specific. They might have strayed off across the border a little bit, but their focus is we report the news of Black people within the Hoosier State. And so they set themselves apart. And in their thing, they're telling us, send us your news, send us what your lodge is doing, send us what your church is doing, send it, and that's down here. Tell them, send you all that information because we love that stuff and we're gonna put it in there. Even the stuff that's happening in Kokomo. They're interested in all of this different stuff. Now here's the Freeman, and here's just two clippings I took out of here. The Freeman in Chicago, here's all the different people that are the people that are distributing the Freeman for the newspaper in Chicago. Because why? Because that's their base is the big cities. And so this other one is where the Freeman is to be found in New York City. That's the other big tall list there. So you find that all through that paper, all these major cities, that's the way they do it. They have these correspondents, these people that are selling papers for them, because you go look at a Freeman, you like to see Casper, Wyoming, Cheyenne, Wyoming, Bismarck, North Dakota. People, I laugh at people, I don't know if there are any Black people in Montana. Oh, yeah, they were. And they were doing the same thing as others, with living and dying, and they might have been selling cattle or doing something unique up there. I don't know. But no, they were in these different places. And those were in those major papers like that. So African-American research requires, we talk about the Black papers. I say you really do need the mainstream paper. We don't have time to talk about that. We talk about online, but offline is really the key. Do not forget that when you're looking for African-American, trying to find newspapers, you have to go offline because the majority of papers are not on the web, not on there. You hear me? They're not there. There's tons of them out there, which makes you imagine how many tons are in university libraries and local libraries and places like that. And so that's going to be a long time before they catch up and get all that stuff digitized. And then universities and public libraries, state historical genealogy societies, that's where you're going to find a lot of these papers in these microfilm cabinets. So here's some finding aids, because we're going to talk about with the ancestor hunt, what you can find online. If you're going offline, and this is something I'm definitely going to send you guys, is the printed finding aids, where you can find the microfilm papers and stuff like that. And there's these three books, I call them the big three. And I won't go through them now, but I'll send you a copy of these. These are the ones that have lots of information on them. Now, here's another resource. I will give you a copy of this too, for sure. Without asking, it'll be part of the package. And this is something I stumbled across and I got so excited. This is an African-American newspaper. Somebody in University of Georgia, librarian, decided they wanted to do this. They had a rich, big collection of Black newspapers too. And so they organized it. They organized their microfilm collection or everything that they had. So it's organized by title listing. So you can look, if you know the title, oh, Mama talked about this paper she got down in Chattanooga called whatever, you can look it up by title. State listing, if you're not sure, you can look by state, see what newspaper. So now all Black newspapers, it didn't have Black Tennessean or whatever. So they're subtle. Lots of times you'll miss it if you're looking for African-American or Black or Negro or whatever. And so the state listing, so then the chronological listing, I learned a lot about newspapers I didn't know existed by using this and looking at it. And that's a bunch of papers, maybe 80 some pages or whatever. And then they have that chronological listing, which I love, because if you're trying to find somebody again, that falls out of the window with the marriage, or I'm sorry, with the, like say the death certificates, and you can't find them because it was 5 years earlier, you're looking for a newspaper that published in that town, Black newspaper possibly, that within that time range. But you can look chronologically and see that. Oh, there's a paper. Let me get that interlibrary loan, right? Let me get the interlibrary loan, get that newspaper, and hopefully I can search through and I'll find my great grandfather in there, his death notice. So they're organized in that specific time period. This is the kind of stuff I'm seeing. This was in the Chicago Defender. I'm sorry, I can't remember. I want to say it was East Chicago, Antioch Baptist Church Anniversary Committee. Oh my gosh, they got together and took this massive picture, and they got kids on their laps and all kinds of stuff. It's just amazing. It's just a sample of what can be found in Black newspapers. And everybody's listed. Everybody's listed. Isn't that something? Absolutely amazing. So if you tie into Antioch Baptist Church, you can start doing the genealogy of that church kind of right there with all these different people, and you got actual pictures and image of all of those people. That's the kind of stuff I'm finding on a regular basis in these Black newspapers to help us build out the community. So I'm going to talk briefly about mainstream newspapers because, again, I say they talk about disparaging things about African Americans, but you know what you do? You hold your nose and you look and you read and you get the information. Because if they're mentioning about your great grandfather Clyde or whatever, at least you know he was alive on this date. He was alive in between those two censuses. So you have to go look for that stuff, even though sometimes you look and saying, man, if I can go back there, I'll be slapping that person. And it's true, but you got to get that information any way you can get it. And so these mainstream newspapers, I'm going to give you this. I say, I got stuff organized that I'm going to send you guys. So it's going to be like Christmas in March or whatever, because I'm going to send you these things I'm talking about, because these are things I found them. I can send you the links to them, or I'm going to have a Google document or Google Drive thing that Matt will have the link to. And I'll have that up for a period of time where you can download, like this thing I'm looking at right here now, that's this annual directory. And this directory, I think it's worthwhile because this was 1921, but it has these entries, like I say, for all these newspapers, it's an annual directory of all the newspapers. It gives great information. And so you've got the entry here for Augusta, Georgia, and it gives all this information about Augusta in 1921. So you get lots of good, again, if you're writing the story, you know about the area, and then it just lists different papers. So the Augusta Chronicle, it says right there every morning, and back then they gave what their political affiliation was. It says Democratic. So we know the party of Lincoln was Republican. And so it turned over like in the 20s, kind of where Blacks started shifting over. FDR was coming after Hoover and that stuff. So again, you got to know your history. And so this sent up a flag. So when I'm looking for papers in a certain area, if there's multiple papers, I'm looking for the Republican early on. I'm looking for the Republican ones first, because they're most likely to have the news of Black people in it more than their adversaries. And so those, I'll prioritize what papers I look at to try to find what I'm trying to find. So again, it's all about being strategic in that way. And so that's why this is important. You can go and look in all these little communities and see what the paper was. If there was a competing paper, you can look at the Republican one in the early days and then the Democratic ones later on. And so this is just a thing I'm going to go through. But this was an amazing article about the highest price for a slave in the South. It was this Adam Scott. He was an old miller. And they go on and on in the Augusta Chronicle, a Democratic paper, talking about this gentleman and his family and how their direct line were millers and how everybody with the highest regards and all this other stuff. So you know when this dude, he wasn't dead yet. So you know when he passed on, they were carrying on, white and Black, because this dude had it going on. And they were just talking, big old article in the Augusta Chronicle about this black slave, highest price slave, when he was enslaved. So it's just really good stuff. So now we're getting on the last thing. We're going to talk about churches and how they go in. Churches have so much information, and we think that they don't have it. In many cases, with us Baptists, we don't have it, but there's still a lot of stuff out there. So I call it collateral church lines and associations. I didn't know this when I was going to church. I was just getting up because I knew that if I didn't get up, I'd be getting up soon enough because I was going to church. I couldn't play like I couldn't. And so I grew up in a church family. But the question here now I'm a researcher is like, okay, who did your ancestors worship with? Who did I worship with in these different pews? And what did we do? Because they did the same things that they did the generation before and the generation before that. So I wanted to find out what this was. So here's what I recommend. This is the kind of slide I'll send you to, is that some of the initial steps to try to find this affiliation. What other churches did they worship with? What other people did they worship with? Well, you should interview and make inquiries of both family and community members. Ask those kind of questions. Look for recordings, transcripts, oral history interviews, both online and off. Vital records can hold clues. Funeral programs are fantastic. That's what we're doing down in Wilmington now, both online and off. City directories can help narrow the search by where the church is, the names and the location. And newspapers, religious and otherwise, are excellent sources for this kind of information to figure this stuff out. How many of us see these? Oh my gosh, these are some of the best sources you can use if you can find them. And I found most of the ones I found from a cousin that I wasn't really even close with, and it was his wife, and that was the in-law. So he married her, but I was able to get these for her. And then she passed, and then everything else that she had, her family didn't want them. So I had all of these different Second Baptist, 1880 to 2005. It was packed full of information. So the members of these congregations, they all get them, and they all have them, so they're somewhere. And so it's just a matter of stumbling across them or trying to be strategic about who was members of that church and figuring it out. But most of them, they have these things in their possessions dating back to the mid-20th century. They publish and distribute them as part of a program, pastors, whatever, or at church anniversaries. The earlier ones are the ones that have much more information. They started streamlining it in like the 90s, 80s, 90s, or whatever. They didn't put as much information. So if you get the older ones, the better off you are. I don't know how many of you have ever seen this. It's a directory of Negro Baptist churches. There's 2 volumes of it. It's a great source for figuring out who was associated with who around the 1940s. This was WPA time when they were doing this kind of stuff. It could be searched by association if you know it, or it could be searched by place. I happen to know the association that I just knew it all the time for our church. It didn't mean anything to me until I started researching. And these have been digitized, so you can look at them and search them. So Happy Trust, you can go there, you can type in the words, directory, what I typed in? I typed in directory of Negro and it brought it up. Now you can start looking through it for your state, for your area. You may not be able to completely download it unless you have higher credentials. But here's Illinois. So here's the Illinois section. I'm pointing right there at Braidwood. Little tiny old Braidwood is in there because all these black communities were in there. But if they had association. So here they are. They're on page 310. So we remember the Fox River Valley. I always remember that. So I wasn't surprised when I saw Fox River Valley. A roar in the house. Yep, Fox River Valley. So the churches that we went long time. We went and ate their chicken and something or whatever. Right, but they fed us after the choir's 15th anniversary or whatever. We would go pretty good distances, but we had built that association, and it was over decades that those associations stayed together. So when you're looking for people, right, you start expanding your net. Here's who they associated with. Church folk that were in Aurora and Braidwood and in Pontiac and different places for me. And I remember these places. So this was the church that we had at First Baptist Church, and then there's Reverend Kilgore there. So these are really valuable for pointing to where you should go in the newspaper searches and whatever, by searching for your church and that kind of stuff and doing strategic searches and stuff. Here's 2 amazing resources that have come online again in the last decade or so, 2 decades. The one is from the American Theological Association. It's called African-American Religious Serials. That covers all different religions, all kind of stuff in there. So it's not, so you can find everything in there. What I said, you find lots of different stuff in there because it's huge. Then the other one's specific to African-American Baptists. And so that's the Baptist serial. They're both really terrific because, again, I heard stuff, and I'm going to share that with you. You hear stuff a lot of times. This first one, it's a big, massive microfilm collection, but they digitized it not too long ago. but it's got reports and other items from different denominations. And I'm going to give you the PDF so you can see everything that they have by state. So you can look and see if your areas are included in it. Here's something, I know you can't see it, but this is just the power of it. This is a resolution. They do this all the time, right? So this is a resolution from the minutes of the Missionary Baptist Convention, state of Georgia, 1876, when most likely there wasn't a lot of death certificates and things available. And so the committee that reports on deceased ministers start laying out all the ones that had died in the last year. So you got the 1880 census, you're looking at, he's not there. This could be something that tells you pretty much when they died or give you leads to find him because he was part of this association. And they reported that he died. And if I captured this, you know, I captured other things in the other reports. If you look through them, you see his name in there before he passed away and what he did and stuff. Here's another one again. It's just to show you the stuff they're doing, but it's just giving you the names of all these people. Because I was always told, again, I listen to stuff and I smile. This church here, the convention. But when I heard people saying a lot of things that you said, let me check my time. Oh shoot, I'm over time now. When they would talk about minutes and stuff, they always say, oh, it's just a church business. It's just a higher level church business. There's nothing in there about the people in the community. It's not true. It's not true. And I'm proving that right here. And people would tell me all the time, oh, don't be worried about looking at the church minutes. I'm glad I didn't listen to them because they're here. And so the other collection, I'll just go through real quick and I'm gonna get you guys out to lunch, but it's the same thing. It's got, this one is at, I don't think it's digitized. It's at Allen County. He's got all the rolls, all the 27 states. And so I'm just going to go through, it's just great stuff. It's not important. I want to get you to lunch. And so I wrote an article. I'll put that in there. I wrote an article on African religion and African-American research process for National Genealogical Society. And so that gives you ideas and clues on what to look for and stuff. And so with that, I'm going to let you go. Don't hurt each other running up down back there to get that good food or whatever. But thank you very much again. Let's enjoy lunch. And then we pick up after lunch at 2 o'clock. Yeah. 2 o'clock. Thank you, guys.